Perfect.
Evening, everyone.
We're live on YouTube now. So if we're all ready to start the meeting, that would be fabulous. Are there any apologies of absence? Not that I'm aware of, but obviously if there's any, no, then we can move on. Any declarations of interest?
No.
No. And the minutes from the previous meeting, are they all agreed?
Agreed. Yep.
Agreed. Brilliant. Matters arising, I don't believe there is any. There's no written questions and petitions, so we'll move on to the committee work plan on page 5. And I know as per the current report that we're looking at in this meeting, there might be some slight change. No, there won't be. I don't know if anyone, Michael, I know you had
Chair, what I would suggest is there are recommendations for further reports to be brought to this committee, and probably those will, subject to committee approving that, become items for the licensing committee work plan in the next municipal year, and they'll probably be added as unallocated items, sort of pending the municipal timetable being set at the first appropriate meeting after the elections, assuming those happen.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Yeah, I'm just on the basis that we're doing the main report tonight, and there's only bits, if I can put it this way, fag ends left. Why can't we do it on the 9th of March to get it out of the way? Is there a reason?
Chair, I think the reason why we won't be able to adopt all of the recommendations from the DfT getting ahead slightly to our report is that the report recommends that further reports be brought to the committee because there are matters that will be policy decisions that councillors will want to consider, and frankly there's too much work for us to do that and bring all of those reports before March, particularly in view of the kind of current circumstances we're working under. So we would like to get ahead with it, and we're recommending that we'll do what we can immediately and bring those matters that need a policy decision, some exploration of the policy decision, back to licensing committee.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Michael. Councillor Churchill.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm happy for it for those reports to come in the new municipal year. It does make sense, and to give officers a chance, because there are extenuating circumstances in this particular case. But I would like to ask if we can have a small verbal report, perhaps, next about any action that's been taken on licensed premises due to breaches of COVID regulations, etc. And I know the police have been involved, and we've had a couple of premises that have come to subcommittee, but if there'd been any warnings or any other action being taken, I think it would be helpful for us to be made aware of those. So if we could have that come to the next, as I say, as a verbal communication, would be fine. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy with that if the committee agrees. I think that would be quite handy. I know we spoke about that briefly previously. If everyone is happy with that work plan, then we can move on to item 7. That's all good. I think what we'll do, obviously, we've got the different groups A, B, and C. What I'll do is I'll go through the groups and go through the standards individually. But for group A, if this is okay with the members, I may, as it's no policy changes needed, take it on block. And if anyone has any comments or questions at this stage, they are more than welcome to contribute them. But if we're happy to agree the recommendations for group A on block, everyone's happy with that. But if anyone does have any questions and comments, obviously this is your time to shine. No? No questions, no comments?
Yeah, yes.
Councillor Churchill, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm here. I think it would be helpful if the contributing officers. I know Adam's here, and I can't see Chris. Oh yes, yes, he is there. Sorry, Chris. If they could just give us a short briefing on the report, would be helpful, just to put our minds in the right place, shall we say, and point out the salient bits that that we need to really look at properly. I mean, I've obviously read it, but there may be things that I missed. So I think it'd be helpful if officers could actually give us a report on, give us a briefing on the report.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. If anyone's happy to do that, I'll Councillor Garnett quickly first.
Well, yes, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pick up where I've got on page 13, Standard 8, Joint Authorization of Enforcement Officer. I put a note here to me. It's the information that's given between neighbouring authorities or authorities where the other drivers are registered. Do we, as a matter of course, get a note from, say, Epping, that drivers X, Y, and Z are now banned from driving, have lost their licence or whatever, so that if they appear on our CCTV or something, we pick them up, or they're picked up for something else, we would know straight away? Is that making sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So, Chair, I think that is actually a useful idea that hasn't been formally the position up to this point, but there is in production a national register of drivers who have been declined as not fit and proper person to hold a licence, which the council's done some work on being ready to sort of implement as soon as that's up and running. So we're contributing our data to it and gone back a very long way, actually looking through records, picking up drivers who, excuse me, I think that's my printer has just decided to go to sleep, drivers who've been declined by the council, and this record should go back 25 years. So it is a very good suggestion, and one that's not plugged at the moment, but very shortly should be. This question about joint authorization, though, is really the idea that if we know that an Epping licensed driver is breaching his licensing conditions in Harlow, we can do something about it, and vice versa. So at the moment, we're largely powerless even to enforce their conditions. So that is, it can be dealt with within existing constitution, so it doesn't need a policy recommendation, but is subject to all the local authorities in the area getting together to have a consistent approach, but it's certainly something we'd support. So. And
sorry, I'm sorry, Mike, I thought you just finished. There's no problem with data protection or anything?
No, because I mean there are proper reasons for sharing this information for protection of the public, so we have to be aware of it, but it doesn't prevent us sharing data on the register and the joint authorization. There would be a proper process to share any sort of enforcement details that are necessary. So yeah, we do have to work within that, but it wouldn't stop us doing it.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Councillor Churchill, do you have another question? You're muted. Is he talking to us? If not, I think, yes, let's move on to the brief overview of the report.
Sorry, Chair, I was muted.
That's okay. I thought you were. You were chatting away. That's okay. More than welcome.
Yes. Off in my own little world, which is a wonderful place. Right. I just wanted to touch base with Michael Pitt on this one. Excellent suggestion. Do you need us as a committee at present to actually ask officers to make approaches to the other councils to look at if we can actually get this set up, or will you be? Or are you happy enough just to go off and do it off your own back, if you like?
I can say, Chair, it's something that the team are already working on, and it may take a little while to come to fruition, but they are doing it, and I think we'd probably only come to committee if we found difficulty in other local authorities teams and ourselves sort of matching up with expectations. But I think it is something that we expect to be able to get in place, and you know, sort of something that, subject to kind of our resources in terms of time, we welcome and look forward to.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed,
Perfect.
Michael. I look forward to seeing that coming to fruition in the course of time. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you.
So,
Yes.
Chair, with your permission, should I just quickly start
Yes.
going
Of
through?
course.
I'm going to take it in turns just to give each other's voice a bit of a rest. So
Yeah.
the first standard is on whistleblowing, and we're suggesting there's no requirement to have a recommendation because already the council has in place a proper whistleblowing policy, so that a councillor who felt things were wrong, a member of staff who felt things were wrong and weren't being dealt with, can in confidence go to that whistleblowing process, and without fear of sort of their position being affected, can raise things, and that is the intention. So you know, just a note really that that's already in place. And I think Chris was going to deal with standard 2 and so forth.
Okay. Yeah, so DFT Standard 2 is in relation to common law police disclosures. So the actual standard, the DFT standard, requires that licensing authorities should maintain close links with the police to ensure effective information sharing procedures and protocols are in place. So currently in Harlow, the licensing team does have an effective working relationship and clear communication channels with the police. We do have a signed protocol that already exists between Harlow Council and Essex Police under the Safer Harlow Partnership. And this protocol is subject to annual review. So in terms of action required, the Harlow is largely compliant already with this standard. The licensing team have been in recent contact in December with Essex Police and Harlow Council Legal Services to ensure that at the next review of our information sharing protocol, we do give full consideration to these new DFT standards, with particular reference to the requirements of common law police disclosure. So again, in terms of this particular standard, like I say, we are already compliant. There is no specific recommendation, and we're not proposing that there's going to be any departure from the DFT standards. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to pass over to Adam.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So the third deals with the DBS. The standard says a decision to refuse or revoke a licence as the individual is thought to present a risk of harm to a child or vulnerable adult should be referred to the DBS. What's our current position? We would take enforcement action against any driver that poses an evidential risk to a child or vulnerable adult, and we would certainly discuss with Harlow Council's safeguarding officer before making such a referral to the DBS. Our only action required for this standard is really to make sure it's included in the new cohesive policy and to make reference to this procedure. And therefore, Harlow standard does not depart from this DFT standard either. I'll pass you back to Michael.
Thanks, Chair. So the next standard is working with the police, and again, we have good individual liaison with the police and a structure through Safer Harlow Partnership with which the council works with the police. And you know, we don't think that any specific policy is required there. Really, we just need to continue with those sort of bilateral relationship with the police. Chris, you got standard 5?
Yeah, so DFT standard 5. So it's still one of the Group A standards. So it's in relation to multi-agency safeguarding hubs, also known as MASH. The standard requires that all licensing authorities should operate or establish a means to facilitate the objectives of a MASH. This must include the sharing of necessary and relevant information between stakeholders. Obstacles in sharing information can be a barrier to effective safeguarding. So currently within Harlow, the licensing team does attend the multi-agency priority subgroup titled Safer Harlow Partnership, ASB and Crime Meeting. This is chaired by Essex Police. It is a quarterly meeting that allows for information sharing amongst stakeholders. In addition to this, Harlow Council also sits on the Missing and Child Exploitation Meeting, referred to as MACE 2. This is a bi-monthly multi-agency meeting that looks at child exploitation data, hotspots, trends, intervention and disruption activity. Historically, this meeting has been attended by the Council's safeguarding officer, and any information relevant to the licensing team could be confidentially shared. Following consideration of these new DFT standards, a licensing team officer will also now sit on this MACE 2 meeting, and this will be in addition to the Council safeguarding officer. The next meeting of MACE 2 is later this week, and as I say, the licensing team will now sit on that panel. So the Council is now compliant with this standard, and no further action is required. And there is no departure proposed from the DFT standard. Thank you. Over to Adam.
Okay, so standard number 6, we're still in Group A, criminal convictions and rehabilitation. The standard states, it talks about the annex to the statutory guidance document is the department's recommendations on the assessment of previous conviction. So we're looking at sort of past criminal history. Our current position is that Harlow has already adopted the Institute of Licensing guidelines back in October 2019, so quite recently. And this already forms clearly a large part of the DFT standards. Such as crimes resulting in death, exploitation, offences involving violence against the person, possession of a weapon, dishonesty, drugs, discrimination, motor offences, and drink and drug driving. As far as any further action required, the Council is already compliant with meeting this standard. Just a bit of consideration will be needed to the existing Institute of Licensing guidelines as far as drafting the new policy, because we've found that the Institute of Licensing guidelines actually goes partly beyond what the DFT propose. In particular, our standards include areas such as other motoring offences, hackney carriage and private hire offences, and vehicle use offences. So we need to make sure we just give those some extra thought and consideration. And then finally, just to point out, therefore, that the Harlow standard already meets the proposed DFT standard for this one. Okay.
Yeah, on DFT standard 7, safeguarding awareness training, as councillors will be aware, the council was early actually in requiring drivers to attend safeguarding awareness training that at that time we called child sexual exploitation training, but the process has been in place for some time now, and clearly at the moment we have to do that using a remote method, and actually we've got plans in place to have the first virtual training session for new applicants in hand, so we don't need any specific policy change on that. We've already got a requirement in licensing policy. Chair.
Thanks, Michael. So DFT standard number 8 is the last of the Group A standards, and it's one that we've already touched on tonight with our initial question. So it's in relation to joint authorization of enforcement officers. So the standard requires that licensing authorities should, where the need arises, jointly authorise officers from other authorities so that compliance and enforcement action can be taken against licensees from outside their area. So currently there are no joint authority agreements in place locally. Harlow Council's licensing team routinely attends the Essex Joint Licensing Forum. This is a meeting attended by all Essex authorities, the fire service and the police. This meeting allows for the sharing of best practice and provides a mechanism for ensuring consistency in approach. So in terms of action required, consideration needs to be given to an agreement between licensing authorities to jointly authorise officers. This would enable the use of enforcement powers regardless of which authority the officer is employed by and regardless of which authority issued the licence. Joint authority agreements will need to be placed on the work plan for the Essex Forum. The date of the next meeting has now been set for the 24th of February 2021. There will then need to be further consideration for discussion with other counties, local counties, and with TfL as well in relation to joint authorisation. So no departure from this standard is proposed, and we have a plan in terms of liaison with other Essex authorities initially. Thank you, Chair. And that concludes the presentation of the Group A standard. So perhaps, Chair, we would like to take questions on those.
Yeah, if there's any questions or comments. Is that Councillor Holcoop with a question?
Thank you, Chair. On this one, as I brought up at the last meeting we had on this whole situation, it was the local authorities joint working that I was concerned about when it came to different operators coming into Harlow with passengers and then working in Harlow from their mobile phone calls. So wondered if that was going to be coming into play under the joint authority agreement, because I think it was Michael said at the last meeting, not every authority is working the same way that we are, and therefore hopefully through this whole scenario, all authorities, especially in our part of the world, will comply with this and do the joint agreements, because this is one of the situations that's not going away, and I wondered how we were going to get on with that side of the agreement. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, I can say I think that if all local authorities implement these standards as they ought to, I mean, all licensing authorities will be required to have regard to them, then that should reduce the inconsistency that we might find. And one of the things that's been vexing at times is local authorities like ours have declined licenses to drivers who have gone to a neighbouring local authority and not been declined, and the existence of the register, which should explain why people have been declined and so forth, should also reduce the likelihood of that happening. The joint authorisation should mean that an Epping Forest enforcing officer should be able to take enforcement action against a Harlow registered driver and vice versa. So it won't bring an end to cross-border working, in that it won't mean that it's unlawful for somebody licensed elsewhere to work in Harlow, but it would mean that Harlow officers would be able to take enforcement action if they're aware of a breach of licensing conditions that takes place in Harlow.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett.
Just going on from there, and I think probably Michael has just answered the question. I was just in the back of my mind, I was wondering whether it could be, okay, you know, Harlow drivers will inevitably take people to Epping, but they should then be banned from applying for trade in Epping and vice versa. Is there nothing in the rules and regulations or something we can put in place perhaps at a future date to say that, you know, you can bring your customer, I don't know how we're going to police it, to Harlow, but you cannot then take Harlow business
So law as it currently stands, which really licensing conditions can't overturn, is that it's not illegal to cross-border work in that way. There is a requirement that for private hire, the operator, the vehicle and the driver have to be licensed by the same licensing authority, but not that all of their work has to take place in the area of that authority. So it won't end that stroke. In technically, applying for hire can only be done by hackney carriages in the area where they're licensed. So a hackney carriage couldn't take a customer to Epping and then just pick somebody up on the street or from a rank. Although some hackney carriages have, effectively have a sort of base and they can operate as a private hire vehicle to all intents and purposes as well. So somebody would then have to book through that base if it's going to be private hire. So it won't bring all of that to an end. Unfortunately, that would require a change in the legislation that government have been sort of contemplating for years and years, actually, because it's a very vexed area. But it should certainly bring more consistency. Good chat.
Yep.
Go on from there. Sorry. Is there any reason they can't be licensed in both districts?
No, I'm not aware that there is. So it would be possible to hold a hackney carriage driver's license in two different areas. It obviously gets expensive, and probably if you wanted to operate in two areas, it's probably more economical to be a hackney carriage driver in one area and then operate as a private hire driver in neighbouring areas if you wanted to. But once you're a private hire licensed, provided that the operator, the vehicle and the driver are licensed by the same authority, then it doesn't stop you taking work that's booked from outside the area.
Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on Group A? No, are we happy to, obviously we'll take the recommendations, we'll do the proper recommendations at the end, but are we happy to move on to Group B now? If we want to do a quick run through of, I think B is, where did we start? From 9 to,
yeah, we're at number 9.
That's the one. If anyone wants to do a quick run through of Group B, policy changes that can be recommended.
Would you add?
Yeah, no, it is me. That's all right. My screen froze, but I seem to be back. Okay, so we move on to the Group B standards, which is the policy change can be recommended at this time. The new standards state that licensing authorities should insist on licensed drivers signing up to the disclosure and barring service online update service. This allows a licensing authority to make as many checks as they wish, but at least every 6 months is the proposed guide. Our current position is that drivers currently have the choice to join the DBS update service every time it comes around that they're due a DBS certificate. They're encouraged to do this by the licensing team, and we estimate that 55% of all licensed drivers are already on the update service. An application for an enhanced DBS with the barring list checks through Harlow Council is £64, and we currently check these regarding that they have to be renewed every 3 years. There is a cost to subscribe to the DBS update service for the applicant, and if they join the DBS update service and maintain the annual subscription, then they would not be required to apply for any further certificates, because once you're on the update service, your current certificate remains live, and all you do is you represent the same certificate. As a point of interest, really, for drivers and applicants more so, but if the DBS update service was not mandatory, a new DBS application every 6 months would cost the driver £128 for 2 DBS certificates rather than the £13 subscription fee. The DFT standards, then Harlow need to make joining the DBS update service mandatory. This will allow us, the licensing team, to remotely check their DBS status on a 6-monthly basis. DBS update service, as already said, it costs £13 a year. And as far as our procedure, we would propose doing all of those on a 6-monthly basis, whereby we do all the drivers in one go. This new requirement will certainly need to be communicated to the licensed trade, and an implementation date will also need to be arranged. Additionally, I'd just like to mention that it should be noted that it's not possible to change the terms of a current license, which has already been issued. For example, if a licensed driver had their license renewed in October 2020 for a 3-year period, then this new requirement would not come into effect until their license is subsequently renewed in October 2023. There will also be enforcement considerations. Should a driver fail to make a payment and they fall off the update service, and this will need to certainly be considered in our new cohesive policy regarding enforcement. I think we're going to read out the recommendations for the Group B. So we recommend in 9, the licensing committee recommend to full council that a new mandate is introduced to require all drivers, new applicants and existing, to join the DBS update service. Point 10, subject to 9, the timescale for this implementation of the mandate be delegated to the Environment and Licensing Manager in consultation with the Chair of the Licensing Committee. Also, just to say that we are not proposing to depart from the DFT standards at this point. Okay.
Thank you, Adam.
Chair.
Should we take Group B on block and then comments and questions on each of the standards afterwards? Yeah. Everyone's happy with that? That's what I thought we were doing anyway, but just to make sure.
So DFT Standard 10 is licensee self-reporting, so councils will be aware that our current licence conditions say that if a driver is arrested, convicted, cautioned, etc. for offences, that they have to report that to us. We say 72 hours. DFT say to us that we should make that 48 hours, and they have a more limited range of offences that should be reported. So what we would need to do is to reduce the time period that we use as policy on licenses from 72 hours to 48 hours. They have to report more quickly, but we're proposing that we keep our slightly broader range of offences so that all we do is reduce the amount of time that drivers have to report things to us. And the recommendation is that licensing committee recommend to full council the change in timescale from 72 hours to 48 hours is approved, and subject to 11, that the timescale for implementation similarly be delegated to Environment Licensing Manager in consultation with the Chair of the Committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So DFT Standard Number 11, again, is one that we've touched on already tonight, and it's in relation to sharing licensing information with other licensing authorities. The standard requires that an applicant should be required to disclose if they have had an application for a licence refused or a licence revoked or suspended by any other licensing authority. The National Anti-Fraud Network has developed a national register of taxi and private hire driver licence refusals and revocations, and this is known as NR3. Tools such as the NR3 should be used by licensing authorities to share information on a more consistent basis to mitigate the risk of non-disclosure of relevant information by applicants. So currently in Harlow, an applicant is required to disclose on the application form if they have had an application for a license refused, revoked, or suspended by any other licensing authority. But like I say, this requires them to self-disclose that on the application form. The council has registered with the National Anti-Fraud Network, and it did that prior to the new DFT standards back in March 2020. And this was with a view to participating in the NR3 scheme that obviously was voluntary at that time. The licensing team have nearly completed the process of going through our subcommittee history of applicants refused a license or drivers that have had a license revoked. And as Michael said earlier, we need to go back over a 25-year period. So far, we've identified 58 individual applicants that possibly need to be included on this new register. So once we've fully considered the information, a letter is then required as part of the NR3 scheme to be sent out to all respective individuals, advising them that we will be posting their details onto the NR3 register. And I know we had a question earlier in relation to data protection. So we will be writing to, like I say, all of these individuals. They then have 28 days in which to appeal this decision. After this date has passed, the individuals who have not appealed will be added to the register. Once all individuals have been added to the register, the licensing team will check the register for all new and renewal applications. Any applicant that is found to be on the register will have their application considered in accordance with our enforcement policy. So like I say, we will look then at all of the new applicants and our renewals to make sure that they don't appear on any of the registers. So in terms of action required, the licensing team will continue with the NR3 process. This has been delayed partly due to the result of some resource being diverted to COVID-19. However, we are still on track with that, and we are aiming to send out letters to all affected individuals before the end of March 2021. So in terms of member recommendations, it's recommended that in paragraph 13, that the licensing committee recommend to full council that the check-in of the NR3 register forms part of the standard new applicant and renewal process for all private hire and Hackney carriage drivers. Subject to 13, the timescale for the implementation of the additional check to be delegated to the Environment and Licensing Manager in consultation with the chair of the licensing committee. So in relation to this standard, we are not proposing any departure from what's required. Thank you. And I think, Adam, we're over to you.
Yeah. Okay, overseas convictions is standard number 12, and the new DFT standard points out that the DBS cannot access criminal records that are held overseas. It then states that licensed authorities should seek or require applicants to provide, where possible, criminal record information or a certificate of good character from an overseas authority to properly assess risk and support the decision-making process. In addition, when an applicant has spent an extended period, 3 or more continuous months outside the UK, then a certificate of good character is also required. So currently, applicants and drivers are required to provide a certificate of good character if they have lived anywhere in the UK for 6 or more months. Yes, sorry, 6 or more. Yeah, that is the current standard, that if they've been away for 6 or more months in the last 5 years, then they need to declare that to us, and we would require a certificate of good conduct. Therefore, what action is required is to consider an amendment whereby if an applicant has spent 3 or more continuous months outside the UK, then we should require a certificate of good conduct rather than our current 6-month requirement. Other actions will include the licensing team will need to update the handbook the web information and make sure drivers are notified in writing of any changes. And what we'll also do is ensure that a new declaration will be inserted into the driver application form. This will allow the driver or more months, continuous months. As far as our member's recommendation, para 15, the licensing committee recommend to full council that if an applicant has spent 3 or more continuous months outside the UK, then a certificate of good character is required. And subject 16 is subject to 15. The timescale for this implementation should be delegated to the Environment and Licensing Officer Manager in consultation with the Chair of the Licensing Committee. Okay, I'll pass you over to Michael.
Thank you, Chair. DFT Standard 13 is in relation to DBS checks for vehicle proprietors. DFT recommend that licensing authorities should require a basic disclosure from the Disclosure and Borrowing Service, and that we do that annually. Currently, we don't ask for a DBS certificate from vehicle proprietors. A proprietor is somebody who owns a vehicle in effect, and a lot of our licensed drivers both own their vehicle and drive it. There's a limited number of people in Harlow who rent vehicles to drivers and who are not licensed themselves as operators or drivers, and they would be proprietors and they would be caught by this requirement. So we need to comply with this standard to require a basic DBS certificate from all of those individuals. So it's a relatively small number. Unfortunately, in a way, they won't be able to take advantage of the online check-in service because that's not available for the basic DBS disclosure. Although presumably if they wanted to make a sort of higher level of disclosure, we wouldn't exclude them from that. The sort of ground requirement is that they're going to have to get a basic DBS certificate and produce it to us every year. If we do that, we won't be departing from the DFT standard. It's not something we do now, so we need a policy change, and we're recommending that the licensing committee recommend full council that any vehicle proprietor who isn't a hackney carriage or private hire, or does not hold a hackney carriage or private hire driver license, must provide an annual basic DBS certificate to the licensing team. And again, subject to that being approved, timescale for implementation of the new requirement be delegated to the Environment and Licensing Manager in consultation with the Chair of the Licensing Committee. That was included in the supplementary agenda, again with apologies. And we should be back to the main published agenda now with Standard 14.
Thank you. I think it's Standard 14, Group C. So what I'll do is I'll take any questions or comments on standards, the recommendations for standards 9 to 13. If anyone's got any input. I'm seeing no hands. Are we okay to move on to Group C? Oh, Councillor Churchill. There's the one.
Sorry, Chair. Just the standard 12, would the new immigration rules, etc., have an effect on that as well, in identifying people with a criminal record? Michael?
I think that in a way they overlap because they deal with people from abroad, but the immigration requirements mean that somebody who isn't entitled to work in the UK can't be licensed at all, and they can only be licensed while they've got established entitlement to work in the UK. But there are a lot of people who are entitled to work in the UK at the moment who, if they've been abroad, any offences they might have committed wouldn't be on the DBS, hence the sort of requirement to overlap. So we still may have drivers from abroad or who have been abroad for some time who need some kind of cover. We're directed to get a certificate of good character or criminal records history if that is available. It depends, I think, on where they've been. Chair.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Michael. And Councillor Edwards?
Yeah, just briefly on 14, if a driver was to have an existing contract with a proprietor who hadn't got the necessary check, as it were, because previously it wasn't deemed necessary, as it were, and if that contract, say, ran for 3 years, would there then be difficulties in enforcing that requirement, as it were, without it having a knock-on effect on arguably the driver's livelihood?
I think if it became impossible for an existing proprietor to rent a vehicle to a driver, I would suggest that driver would have to find a different proprietor that he could rent from. I don't think that we'd want to be uncharitable towards any drivers with good records and so forth. So I think we probably would have to look at that carefully if it arose. But yeah, if we comply, well, certainly if we find things untoward about proprietors through the DBS check, we're probably well advised to do something about that. The concern I think that DFT are trying to cover here is that probably not so much in the setup in Harlow, but in some circumstances, you can have a market dominated by a proprietor who never appears in the licensing system otherwise, and he's got quite a lot of control over the sort of individual drivers because they may effectively owe their livelihood to him, and they could be potentially cat's paws in a sort of criminal network, and DFT are trying to do their best to make sure that doesn't happen. And so we should be clear that we put the protections in place.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Any further questions from members? No, so I will take that as we are happy with the member recommendations for Group B, but I'll move on to, you will have a chance for any further questions at the end, by the way. But now if we could move on to Group C, which is the reports to be brought forward to a future meeting.
Thank you, Chair. So DFT Standard Number 14 is in relation to licensing policies. The standard requires authorities to produce a cohesive policy document that brings together all policy and procedures. When formulating policies, the overriding objective must be to protect the public. Policies should be reviewed every 5 years, but should also consider interim reviews should there be significant issues arising in that area. So currently in Harlow, we do have a very comprehensive range of separate policies and procedures. These do include private hire vehicle licence conditions, Hackney carriage vehicle licence conditions, private hire driver conditions, private hire operator conditions, convictions guidelines, a Hackney carriage handbook, Hackney carriage bylaws, a private hire handbook, and an enforcement policy. So in terms of action required to meet the requirements of this standard, we will need to review our policies and procedures and into one cohesive document, and obviously implement the changes that are required in relation to these new DFT standards. So the timescale for the introduction of the new policy will be dependent on compliance with the other required standards. The new policy will need to reflect all the changes as a result of the new standards. So in terms of member recommendation, at this stage, we're recommending that we will come back with a full policy. So we will do a full review of existing policies into one cohesive policy document, but subject to 17, a draft of the new policy will be brought back to licensing committee for discussion and approval prior to full sign-off of a new policy. Timescale to be agreed at the 9th of March 2021 committee when the dates for 21-22 are available. So subject to the new agreed policy, we wouldn't be proposing any departure from the DFT standards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
15.
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me?
You're a bit robotic, Adam. And you know you're frozen.
Okay, so perhaps to ensure continuity, I'll have a attempt at
Oh,
this.
is he back? You back?
I am back.
Yes.
It
Well, I
would
was just about to say,
seem.
Yes. That's much
do go ahead.
better.
I'll see if I can start, and if something goes wrong. 15 is it's covering the duration of licenses. I feel this may have quite an impact on the way we do things. The new standard discusses the issue of driver licenses. It states that risks can be mitigated for drivers by authorities undertaking regular interim checks. So during the license period, e.g., regular DBS, the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act, as we follow for taxi and private hire licensing, does set a standard length at 3 years for taxi and private hire vehicle driver licenses, and it also sets a 5-year period for operator licenses. So currently in Harlow, our new and renewal driver applications are given an option of a 1 or 3 year license. Their DBS and medical checks must cover the entire duration of the license they apply. And currently, about 30% of our licensed drivers are actually on a 3-year license already. We also have some licenses that are restricted due to right to work in the UK restrictions. There are type B and type A type right to work, and dependent on that may depend if their license is also restricted. So just to bring that to your attention, that not everybody can have a 3-year license. I then go on about our procedures, and hopefully it's not too wordy, but as we said earlier, this will come in another report to the licensing committee at a further date. For drivers, currently their DBS is carried out every 3 years. Therefore, to have a 3-year license, they have to provide either a new DBS or we're able to do a DBS update service check. Just to point out really that Group 2 medicals are recognised nationally, and they're a 5-year medical check, and they were created for. They have a new medical. Their 55th, 60th, then they go annually after that. The taxi and private hire licence in Harlow also require 5-year Group 2 medicals, but we base this on when an applicant receives their first licence, and then we work that date until they pass their 64th birthday, at which time they will then go on to annual medicals. I'm going to provide a little bit more detail about medicals as drivers get to the sort of, later in age. We've got in Harlow that licensed drivers under 60 receive a 5-year medical. Therefore, these drivers are currently restricted to 1 3-year license within a 5-year period. That's because over a 5-year period, they can only have a denomination of 1 3-year license and then 2 1-year licenses to go with that. And also, after an applicant's 62nd birthday, only 1-year licenses are available because of the need for a Group 2 medical examination annually after the age of 64. And we estimate that currently 18% of Harlow's licensed drivers are at the age of 62 and over. And then just to point out that another check carried out by the licensing team is that of driving licenses, which are checked online using a DVLA share code, and at every license renewal, whether they are on a 1 or 3-year license. What action is required next? it is needed to consider the current procedure whereby DBS and medicals cover the licence duration and whether this continues to be the best option. And obviously it goes without saying that 6 monthly checks will no longer cover to the end of a licence period if indeed we adopt the 6 monthly DBS checks. Here we recommend in 19 to members that they note the contents of this standard and feedback initial comments at this committee for officers to consider as part of a further report. And 20, a further report is brought before the licensing committee specific to this matter. Timescale to be agreed at the 9th of March 2021 committee when the dates for the 21-22 are available. Whether this departs from the DFT standard will come to fruition at the next meeting.
Thank you, Adam.
No, thank you, Chair. On to standard 16. I should just point out that I think officers may have been under the impression that next year's municipal timetable is set before the end of this year's, but we won't actually know the dates. We'll know roughly what the layout is, but they won't formally be determined. That's why it says when the dates of 2021, 22 are available. Standard 16 relates to staff of private hire vehicle operators and the operators themselves, so the principal of the operating company and any staff who have access to booking records should also be subject to basic DBS checks. And clearly the intention there is that cover the possibility that dishonest staff may be using the booking records, for example, to inform criminal associates that such and such a household has gone to the airport and so forth. So they're trying to time that up, a whole range of things that this could cover. At the moment, we ask operators, well, we require operators to carry out a DBS check, a basic DBS check, when they're licensed. But that isn't annual because they can be licensed either yearly or every 5 years. Some operators are operator drivers and they would be covered by the enhanced DBS check, but otherwise we're slightly falling short of the standard that DFT are now recommending. And we currently don't ask any of the ancillary staff to have basic DBS checks, probably in common with other licensing authorities. So we have to up our game to meet the DFT standard. We'd have to require a register of staff from all operators as part of the licensing process who take bookings and dispatch vehicles, and we'd have to require those staff to have a DBS check as a condition of license, and we'd have to require operators to have an annual basic DBS check, whether or not they're licensed for 5 years or 1. And so what recommended is that members of the committee note the contents of this standard and feedback any comments that have to sort of guide our process of writing a further report, and that we bring back a report before a future licensing committee when the timetable is known. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. And Chris, I assume we're on to now.
We certainly are. So DFT Standard 17 is in relation to language proficiency. The DFT standards require all licence holders to demonstrate proficiency in English language. All drivers should be able to converse with passengers to understand destination, estimates of time, along with other common passenger requests. A lack of language proficiency could impact on a driver's ability to understand written documents, such as policies and guidance. These could relate to the protection of children and vulnerable adults, and applying this to identify and act on signs of exploitation. A licensing authority's test of a driver's proficiency should cover both oral and written language skills to achieve the objective stated above. So currently in Harlow, Harlow Council requires all new drivers to pass a knowledge test. as part of the application process. A basic grasp of the English language is needed in order to complete the knowledge test. For example, drivers need to understand and respond to the oral question put to them in order to pass the test. There is currently no reading or written assessment. The current position at Harlow does not fully satisfy the DFT requirements. So in terms of action required, there are different ways in which we could approach this. So we could look to look for external courses, and that there's a course that's used, I think it's the B1 course, and it's used in relation to British citizenship. Or we could look at accepting equivalent qualifications. So if the applicant held an English qualification such as a GCSE or A-level or a degree, again, we could look to accept that. Or we could indeed look to do our own in-house assessment as part of that knowledge test. So there's different ways that we could approach that, and we'll explore those in the further committee report. We will also need to consider as an authority whether any additional test or proof of proficiency is required for our existing drivers, or whether we're just going to require this for our new applicants. So, like I say, we will undertake further research and report back to members. So in terms of member recommendation, it's recommended that in paragraph 23, members note the contents of this standard and feedback initial comments at this committee for officers to consider as part of the further report. Paragraph 24, it's recommended that a further report is brought back before the licensing committee in relation to this standard. Again, the timescale to be agreed at the March 21 committee, or when the dates for 21-22 are available. So in terms of departure from the standard, again, that would need to be explored in the further report. Thank you. I think Adam's over to you.
Okay. So the DFT standard number 18, in-vehicle visual and audio recording, being CCTV, and will probably sound quite familiar as this did go to committee in January last year, 2020. The new DFT standard sets out that all licensing authorities should consult to identify if there is any local circumstances which indicate that the installation of CCTV in vehicles would have either a positive or an adverse net effect on the safety of taxi and private hire vehicle users, including children, vulnerable adults, and that potential privacy issues should be taken into account. So as we already know, it went to committee last year. It was reviewed at that time, and it did not identify any local circumstances that justified a CCTV mandate. In terms of the further action required, the licensing team shall raise the issue again at Essex liaison working groups and with the police directly to see how crimes are categorised, to see if more information can be obtained regarding crimes connected with licensed vehicles in Harlow. Member recommendation at 25, no specific recommendation at this time. However, members are to note the current position in respect of this standard. Okay.
Adam, so the final DFT standard, members will be pleased to hear, is in relation to stretch limousines. DFT considered the issue of licensing stretch limousines. They're quite difficult vehicles because they don't really conform to normal design criteria for vehicles, because they've generally been assembled sort of ad hoc from vehicles. But they do recommend that local authorities shouldn't adopt policies that prevent them being licensed, because there's some concern that that might send people into the hands of unsupervised operators. And therefore we should have proper consideration to licensing them where we can satisfy ourselves they're fit for use. Anything that seats larger than 8 people shouldn't be licensed as a private hire vehicle, because it should be a public service vehicle and licensed by the DVSA. But anything that's clearly designed for up to 8 people, we should consider. We don't have any specific policy. We haven't needed any thus far in recent years. We haven't been approached to license, or finally to license any stretch limousines, but we should plug that gap with an explanation of how we're going to deal with it if it does arise. So we're sort of considering that we need a policy for executive chauffeuring limousine applications, which tell us what we're going to look for when we examine the vehicles to see if they're fit for use. And like more traditional chauffeur vehicles generally, I think we could see a case for exempting them from carrying the plates that we normally require on private hire vehicles. And so we need to be clear about when we're going to exempt drivers from showing the plate and when we're not. So our recommendation is that councillors note the current position in relation to this standard. We bring a further report to licensing committee when we looked at all of those issues. And I did have a thought that occurred to me that might assist, and I've temporarily lost sight of it in terms of how we take things forward. But I think we're sort of inviting questions and discussion. The thought was that we've invited councillors to give us views and opinions, but we're not going to make a determination on this before we write full reports. So if councillors encounter situations that they think they should bring to our attention to go into that report, we'll try and accommodate in the report, even if it's after this committee. So this isn't the last chance to raise things with us. And if it's a point that needs serious consideration, we'll try and make sure we cover it in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Are there any comments and questions of the member recommendations from Group C, standards 14 to 19? So I've got Councillor Holcoop, Councillor Churchill, then Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Under the limousine section, it says that there's not a suitable ramp to carry out inspections at the moment. So if limousines came into the normal side of things, how would we do the testing at the approved testing station if the ramp's not long enough to take the limousine? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I think what we'd have to do is identify a supplementary approved testing station specifically for carrying out vehicles that are too large to go on the ramp at the current test station, rather than sort of bust our contract with the current contractor. I think has served us very well, actually. And that is probably the approach we take. If at some point we will have to re-tender our contract, and we may invite tenderers to explain what provision they could make for stretch limousines if we've got any license at that time in the new contract. But I think it's probably more practical to send stretch limousines to a different testing station than to sort of change our contractor at this point.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Michael. Councillor Churchill.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's a comment, really. I just wanted to express my thanks to Chris, Michael, and Adam for the excellent presentation. And obviously, a lot of hard work has gone into this, and to make it easy for us mere mortals to actually understand what's going on. And it certainly has helped me a great deal. I don't have any recommendations or anything to make for Group C. They need to stay as is, sort of, brought to a future meeting. But I just wanted to record my thanks because it's a very, very good piece of work.
Yeah, that's agreed. I think it's agreed by the entire committee. That has been massively helpful. grouping it and breaking it down for us all, as we Councillor Church said, mere mortals. Councillor Garnett, if you're next.
Yeah, I echo Councillor Churchill's remarks on that. I've got a couple of little things. Michael, you talked about, let's get up, going back to front actually. So we talk about the limousines. You seem to be saying you understand why they may not want a license plate stuck on their car. Could we not have some form of windscreen permit as a replacement? Because obviously then people can see that it is registered and licensed by Harlow or whoever it's registered by. So that's just a suggestion there. Research report. I was looking at the sort of medical checks. I assume the checks you make are through the, and Andrew probably knows more about this, the National Health Service medical records, but there's nothing in the license application that states that the applicant should inform the licensing authority if they've been diagnosed by a doctor. If they've had a stroke, for instance, the doctor may recommend that you don't drive for 3 months or something, but they don't have to report that to you. And if it's in the middle of a 3-year license, you wouldn't necessarily pick it up. Is this something that we should look at for future applications, that they, as part of their criminal convictions or criminal things they get up to, or may get up to, sorry, but if there are any medical conditions which require them to cease driving for a period of time, they should be informed the licensing authority?
So I would comment that clearly if they're told not to drive, then they'd be breaking Highways Act legislation as well as licensing conditions. But we do test them. Tests are carried out by a medical examiner, registered medical examiner, not generally speaking the applicant's own GP, but they do have access to the applicant's medical records when they carry out those tests. In terms of requirement to report to us unfitness to drive, I think that is a licensing condition at the moment, isn't it, Adam?
I don't believe it is, and I think Councillor is a good point for something to consider adding in to our conditions and procedures. Certainly it's in there for the criminal side of things, but regarding medical issues, I think it might be absent. Yeah.
It's been very helpful to discuss it and possibly to take on board a useful recommendation then.
Yeah. Finally, Chair, on the standard 16 private hire vehicles, operators and staff, if a member of staff has got a serious conviction, I take it they wouldn't be allowed to participate in that particular company or any company regard to license and trade.
Yeah, we're going to require a similar set of standards as we have for driver licensing in relation to staff working for operators. So, we would have to, so it's the operator who's being licensed, but we're effectively controlling the kind of people that he can employ. So we'd have to have a sort of set of criteria that made it plain to the operator what they could do and what they couldn't do, rather than him present a lot of staff and him have to, sort of get into that situation where his staff aren't acceptable.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Michael.
Oops.
Councillor Edwards, did you have your hand up earlier? No, you didn't. Did any members have any further comments or questions on Group C? Any comments or questions on the report overall? No, then we can move on to the report recommendations, A to C. So recommendation A is that the committee determine that each of the Department for Transport standards set out in the report below is appropriately allocated to the groups A to C, and note that these matters set out under the heading Group A, no policy changes required. Is that agreed?
Yeah, agreed.
Brilliant. So that means we can move on to recommendation B, which is subject to A. The committee recommends to full council the adoption of the policy changes set out at recommendations item 9 to 16 under the heading in the report below. Group B, policy change can be recommended at this time.
Sorry, Chair, I think,
yes,
subject to Michael, should that be items 9 to 13?
It should be 9 to 13. Oh, that's actually a typo in the agenda. Yes, it should be 9 to 13. That's correct.
So there are standards 9 to 13, but we did number the recommendations, but the recommendations under item 13 are labelled A and B because it was sort of almost impossible.
Yes, of course.
Our colleagues in governance, when they're issuing the supplementary agenda, to kind of match them up. So it is either the recommendations under standards down to 13 or recommendations labelled 9 to 16 plus A and B under standard 13.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hannah, that's a real headache to.
If that could be amended, are we all in agreement over recommendation B then?
Yep.
That's fine. Thank you for that, Dimple. I would not have noticed. Pass me by. And recommendation C is subject to A. The committee receives reports at future meetings in relation to the DFT standards set out under the heading Group C, report to be brought to a future meeting. That's all agreed?
Yep.
Perfect. So that report, which was an excellent report, so thank you all. So we'll move on to agenda item 8, which is references from other committees, which I don't believe there's any. No, and any matters of urgent business. I've not received any, but see if anyone has any. Councillor Edward.
Just briefly, I wonder whether it's possible to have a once the meeting is closed, whether it be possible just to have a discussion with yourself and Dimple regarding a matter I raised privately, as it were. So it's not for public discussion.
Is that with the entire committee, Councillor Edwards?
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's fine. I guess you can arrange a time and a place for that. Well, then I think we are at the end of the agenda. Thank you all. I know
Thank
it's
you, Chair.
a long day on Zoom all day, but yeah, thank you.